Hello everyone, and welcome to the DFIR webcast, 50 Shades of Hidden, diving deep into code injection. I'm Benjamin White with the SANS Institute, and I'll be moderating this webcast. Today's featured speaker is Jake Williams, a malware researcher for CSR Group. Before I turn things over to Jake, the Q&A portion will take place at the end of the webcast, but please feel free to submit your questions at any point by using the chat window. Right now, I'd like to introduce our featured speaker, Jake Williams.
Howdy, can everybody hear me? If I can get just quick a green check or a red X, something. Okay, awesome. Okay, cool deal. So I'll go ahead and get started here. Obviously, this first slide here is a plug for the DFIR Summit. Strongly suggest if you guys are looking for something to do over the summer and really bolster your knowledge of DFIR. The SANS DFIR Summit is definitely a place to go. There's some great speakers there. Obviously, I'm a little biased. I'll be speaking there as well. But there's a whole lineup of awesome speakers there on a number of topics. And then if you're coming for the conference, no reason not to stay for a little bit of training. I'm also teaching SANS Forensics 610. So if code injection appeals to you and you haven't seen or haven't done a lot of malware reverse engineering yet, certainly recommend the Forensics 610. Gives you a good head start into malware reverse engineering specifically, and obviously we talk more about code injection and that as well. So without any further ado, let's get started. We'll talk about code injection. Just an outline of what we're going to cover today. I want to talk just an overview of what is code injection. I hear people all the time talk about code injection and DLL injection, and honestly, for most people, this is just FM. As in freaking magic, right? I mean, most people look at this and they say, you know, hey, we have this basically that we have code injection going on, or the attacker used an interpreter and it injected into a running process. But in many cases, when I start digging down and I talk to people, they don't really understand what it is that they're looking at. So I want to talk a little bit first about what is code injection, how does it work, and then we'll talk about the motivations. Why do attackers do it in the first place? I mean, obviously, this must be more difficult than simply double-clicking an executable and having it run on the process list. We'll talk about some of the mechanics, the actual application programming interfaces or Windows APIs that go into making code injection happen. I'll talk about some strategies for detection. Then, depending on our time, we will, well, not depending on, we'll do a little bit regardless, but we'll break into the VM. We'll open up IDA Pro. I promise not to make the assembly instructions too scary. And yeah, and so we'll jump in there and we'll knock out some of that reverse engineering. I have a little bit of parting thoughts, and then I'll take some questions and answers. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and get started. So really, from a definition standpoint, we talk about code injection. This is the attacker running code in the context of another process. Right. I want to talk about another definition too, module. So essentially what I'm looking at here, and this is a fairly abstract definition, but I'm talking about code with a valid PE or portable executable header that the Windows loader places into memory. So the Windows loader will happily load any code that you ask it to using their wonderful load library API. Happily load any code that you ask them to as long as it has a valid PE header. One of the things a lot of people don't think about, they think about modules being .dll or potentially .exe or .sys, and it turns out the Windows loader just doesn't care. You can name it .x1, .x1, and call the Windows loader. The Windows loader will just load it right up. So it's all kinds of happy to do that for you. So what is the attacker doing? Well, the attacker wants to not stand out on the process list, right? My grandmother, God rest her soul, knew where the task manager was at. So she would oftentimes, possibly not as often as we would have liked, but we would certainly look in the task manager and try to discover if there were any unknown processes running. Now, of course, this is fraught with danger anyway, because I can just name my process service host, and and then again, Grandma's not going to know whether there's 6 or 7 service hosts running today. But realistically, the attacker, at least from a forensicator standpoint, beating the forensics guys, he doesn't want to stand out in the process list. And so this injected code takes advantage of already running processes. There are some variants, and we'll talk a little bit about this variant that will actually start a brand new process to victimize. Turns out there are some processes with Windows 2, as you're probably well aware, that can't be stopped without shutting down the system. So LSAS or services.exe, for instance. So if an attacker can manage to inject code into one of these processes that can't be terminated without shutting the system down, there's no way without shutting down what could potentially be a high availability system that the responder can even get the attacker out of memory. So this is another great advantage for basically targeting one of these long-running processes or for code injection in general. So other things that we want to think about from an attacker motivation standpoint. A lot of AV products try to monitor risky behavior. They do things, they look very carefully at registry rights to persistence keys or network access. That's a very common one as well. And so when we look at the network access in particular, a lot of our antivirus products will flag on anything that tries to call out to the network. It'll say, I'm sure you guys have all seen the pop-up before. It obviously depends on your antivirus solution. But it'll say something like, process X or process Y, process Z, whatever it is. Maybe it's maybe it's malware.exe is trying to access the network. Is that okay? And if it's malware.exe, most people will just click no. Honestly, most of my users will just click yes no matter what. And that's good from an incident response standpoint if you want to get lots of incident response work, but it's bad if you're the security administrator. So the attackers, though, would prefer you don't have to click anything. They don't want to depend on bad user behavior. And so generally what will end up happening there is that what they can do is inject into a process that can already access the network. For instance, Internet Explorer has already been given carte blanche access to the network. And in this case, they'll just inject into or start a brand new hidden copy of Internet Explorer.exe, inject their code into it, and then they can talk freely to the network without the antivirus caring at all. It turns out that running our code for a process trusted by the antivirus also means we get a free ride. It's amazing to me, but many antivirus products don't notice when code is injected into their own processes. And believe it or not, they always trust themselves. So there are cases with certain antivirus products where they'll say, no, you're not allowed to touch the basically, you're not allowed to touch this registry key that changes certain antivirus configurations. Only the antivirus process is allowed to do that. It turns out that that doesn't really impact you at all if you are injecting into the antivirus process, because as far as the AV process can tell, you are the AV process. So enough about attacker motivation there, right? The attacker, it's quite clear why the attacker wants to do it. This is a very juicy place to be. How about targets? So this is really, what process do we want to victimize? So a few years ago, service host was by a long shot the most common process that I saw targeted. There are several reasons for that. Mostly, admins are afraid to mess with anything that's a Windows system process, in particular service host.exe. And so this is a very, very popular target. I still see a lot of malware named service host, but as far as injecting into service host, you just don't see it as much. So then Microsoft came along with user account control, starting in Windows Vista. And so at this point, we have what is probably an unprivileged process. Let's say that the user gets exploited by visiting a malicious page that has some flash on it. And so maybe some 0-day for flash. In this case, it's running under the user context, this bad malware, this bad flash file. And so this is going to pop a UAC dialog unless you have those explicitly turned off, and the attacker can't count on that, if you try and inject into some system process like service host or LSAS or WinLogon. So what we've seen is a huge transition down to basically injecting into Explorer.exe. Now this has always been a fallback. Back in the early days before UAC, most of the malware that we saw would try to inject into a system process first and then would fall back to Explorer. But oftentimes now we're seeing them just go directly to Explorer. And so Explorer is nice. It doesn't stay up as long as the machine's up, but it does stay up as long as basically until the user logs out. And in most cases, that ends up being the same as when the machine shuts down. Only in some rare cases, and with these multi-user machines, or one user logs off, another logs on, maybe like a kiosk, would this really matter? And so the great thing about Explorer from an attacker standpoint is that it's owned by the user, and they're guaranteed not to get a UAC dialog. Let that sink in for a second, right? So now we have this process that's always owned by the user. The exploit that the attacker takes advantage of from a client-side standpoint is also running under the user context, which means they can always inject into Explorer.exe. A couple of the samples we'll take a look at later today actually do just that. They'll inject into Explorer.exe. So to understand code injection, we have to talk about virtual memory. I don't like to geek out on this stuff, but it's unfortunate. It's just something that you have to understand. Otherwise, this is just smoke and mirrors. And honestly, that's what I'm trying to solve with this webcast anyway, is to try to get rid of some of the smoke and mirrors that people see when they talk about code injection. So just up front, we have to understand that each process gets its own virtual memory space. And so if we have two processes, let's say malware.exe and explorer.exe, malware.exe can't touch explorer.exe's process space without going through the operating system. So there has to be some API call that's made that allows you to talk between those processes and actually basically talk between those processes, allocate memory, change memory. So because every process has its own unique address space, code injection relies on a standard set of APIs to write code into memory. The ones we want to look for as we start looking at APIs with reverse engineering, we're looking at open process, we're looking at virtual ALEC-X, and this write process memory. So just for a moment, I'll talk about what open process means. Open process basically, the open process call basically allows you to get a handle to a running process. And so what the open process call, what we want to do is we want to focus on that open process call. The fact of the matter is that open process only receives a process ID. And most people, when they're looking at this stuff, they're really looking for a process name as we start reverse engineering. We'll look at how to deal with that in a few minutes here. But we start looking as well, we look at virtual ALEC-X. And virtual ALEC-X is an interesting API call. If we only wanted to allocate memory in our own process, then we would do it with virtual ALEC, or we would simply do a regular malloc, the old C-style malloc. This virtual ALEC-X allows you to allocate space, memory space, in the context of another running process. Now, before you can do that, you have to have a handle of that open process. And then we follow up with this write process memory. And this does exactly what it sounds like. Again, there's no reason to do this in your local process. If you wanted to do that, you just dereference a pointer. In this case, with write process memory, what you're doing is you're writing into the context of another process. And so if you ever see this, see these API calls, if you're looking at a piece of malware, I want you to immediately start thinking, hey, they're going to do some type of code injection. So you want to look for these APIs in the malware imports, and if you're debugging, you want to set breakpoints here using a debugger. Even if you don't know anything at all about this, if you just run strings and you happen to see these three strings in a binary together, I'm going to go with this binary is going to do some type of code injection. Now you'll need some reverse engineering training like Forensic 610 or similar to understand exactly where or how it's injecting, but definitely want to take a closer look at it and not count on the fact that there's going to be a running process in the process list. All right, so the malware has to execute the code. We have the code now written into the memory space of the remote process. First, we got to handle the process. Then we allocated some space in the remote process. Now we have to we wrote it in. Now we have to execute the code. The most prevalent by a long shot Windows API that's used to do this is something called create remote thread. And what this does is it creates a new thread of execution in that victim process, the one that we just allocated memory in and wrote a bunch of data into. And so it turns out that a process can have many threads, and a thread is just a stream of execution. So a process by default will have at least one thread when it first starts up. But now we have multiple threads in the process. And in any case, if you look at your task list command or the outputs of your task list, it doesn't show you how many threads are running. So this is very difficult to detect. Some tools like Process Hacker or Process Explorer show that, but it's also very difficult to follow up on and figure out which thread is the malicious one. So again, this is very stealthy, but just understand here, again, this is the API that we're looking at here, this create remote thread. So we're looking at this create remote thread as being the API that we want to focus in on for the actual start of the malware. So what does create remote thread do? Well, most often what create remote thread is going to do is load a new DLL into the victim process. DLL is a dynamic link library. You've got tons of DLLs on your system now. In this case, this DLL is just going to load, basically create remote thread will load a new DLL into the victim process. This new DLL with the new thread that's executing is going to perform malicious activities in the victim process. Now, what's great for us as incident responders is that this DLL will normally show up in the loaded module list. If load library, the load library API is called, it'll show up in the loaded modules list, but there are some tricks that can be used to hide it, and we'll talk a little bit about those, although it gets a little bit more advanced. So what is this loaded modules list anyway? So it turns out it's a doubly linked list. Basically, there's a forward and a backward link pointer, and basically it points to all of the DLLs loaded into a given process. Sysinternals has an awesome tool called listdlls.exe, and that'll walk the list and report on modules loaded into a process. The load library API adds new modules to the list. So if you can manage to get a module loaded without load library, then there's not going to be any module, no module list entry to find. So again, create remote thread is often going to load a new DLL in the victim process. Yeah, I think I jumped back. I apologize. Jump back a slide there. Or I have a duplicate. I have a duplicate slide. Sorry about that. So bottom line, right? We're looking for this create remote thread, potentially looking for load library as well. Now let's take a look at this, an actual walkthrough of this process. So I've got this malware.exe process that's running. Let's just assume again that we got exploited by a malicious flash 0 day. And so my malware.exe, he's got a number of DLLs loaded, and he targets explorer.exe. The first thing he's going to do is he's going to get a handle to explorer.exe. And there are some APIs down here for each step that I'm going to point out, and then I'll walk through this in a little bit more detail as we go. But basically the APIs that you're looking for here are create tool help 32 snapshot. Now, I don't know why anybody at Microsoft would name something, name an API that exceeds some 15-character limit, but in any case, I assure you that's all one line, all one word. Create tool help 32 snapshot is actually going to return to you a list of all the running processes. Now again, it's a snapshot in time, just like it sounds like, so it'll return to you a list of running processes for right now. Basically then it's on the user or on the malicious code to walk through those processes using a call called process32 first, and there's a corresponding call on here called process32 next. What that's going to do is that's going to allow the attacker to locate a particular process in memory, because open process needs a process ID, not a process name. Well, it turns out that their structures returned by create tool help 32 snapshot and accessed by process 32 first and process 32 next. It turns out that those contain the same structure, contains both the process ID and the process name, the actual executable name, and so the attacker is able to use this essentially to locate the PID, the process ID of the process they want to inject into. When you see all this code, you can basically just call this, any code containing these three here, you can just call this a process ID hunter or a PID hunter. He's got a name, he's looking for a process ID. Okay, so the next step the attacker is going to use is he's going to allocate memory in explorer.exe. And the API that he's going to use to do this is virtualloc.exe. And so if you notice here, I have a new, basically new empty memory space in explorer.exe. So basically at this point the attacker has loaded some memory, but there hasn't been anything done with this yet at all. So again, look for this virtualloc.exe. If the attacker only wanted to allocate memory in his own process space, he doesn't have to call an API like that. He can just say malloc, or in some cases virtualloc. But the virtualloc.exe very specifically is used to inject or to create a memory space in a remote process. So the next thing our attacker is going to do is he's going to write a name of a DLL into the victim process. Now the reason I have quotes up there is, as opposed to the others here where I'm actually implying that there's code loaded, right? In the malcode.dll case, he's only writing the string malcode.dll. This is actually a precursor step for loading malcode.dll into memory using the loader. The problem is the loader can't reach, the loader here in explorer.exe can't reach back into malware.exe's process space to retrieve the string name of the API that's going to be loaded. So what we find is that write process memory then is used to write the name of the DLL that's going to be injected into our victim process. Finally, malware.exe is going to create a new thread in explorer.exe, and for the start address of this new thread, he's going to call load library. And so there's a couple of things that we'll see here to find, basically, to get this whole process started. You'll see this combination of get module handle and get proc address used to locate the actual address for load library that's going to be used as a start address in the new process. And then you'll see a call to create remote thread to load malcode.dll into the actual process space of explorer.exe. Now, this is kind of interesting because what happens when malcode.dll executes? is that essentially what happens when malcode.dll executes is that a special export from the DLL called DLL main is executed. Now normally in malware, DLL main will start a brand new thread of execution and go about doing its nastiness. In a normal DLL, this DLL main construct is basically just set up to do some housekeeping essentially, allocate some global data structures and then exit, get out of the way essentially. But in this case, when we have our malware, it's much more likely that essentially the DLL main is going to start a new thread. It's not going to yield control, and malcode.dll, whatever code is in there, will continue to execute for the lifetime of the process. So great. So how do we detect this stuff? Well, step one is that we have to look at the list of loaded modules in order to find injected code. The good news is that by looking at the loaded modules and the processes, this can help us find DLL path hijacking attacks. There are some really good write-ups out there on the SANS pen test blog. Mark Baggett has done more than a couple on DLL path hijacking. And so if you're not familiar with that, I would point you to the SANS pen test blog. But in any case, if we're looking at loaded modules, it'll help us detect these path hijacking attacks. And there are GUI, command line, and memory tools that are available to help out with all of this. And we'll look at some of those tools now. So the first one is by a long shot the most versatile because it's always installed on your machines, at least recent machines. And so we can use Tasklist to list loaded modules with a /m switch. And basically what this is going to do is display the modules loaded in every process. Now the only problem here is that while we're able to see the modules loaded in a process, so for instance in our last case we'd be able to see malcode.dll loaded into Explorer, it doesn't show the path for each DLL. So if we've been subject to a path hijacking attack, for instance, we might see wininet.dll and think, yeah, that looks good. That's perfectly legit, except we would find out that it was in C users, Jake, application data temp, wininet.dll, in which case that's not good. So while Tasklist is awesome in that it's a built-in tool, it's always available to us as instant responders, we don't have to bring our own kit. It's kind of a little pain from that perspective because essentially we're stuck with not getting the path for the DLL, and that makes it difficult to determine whether it's benign or not. We can also use this to display processes containing a particular loaded module. So let's say that I've discovered, not wininet in this case, right? Although I do actually use the search for something. I'll talk about this in a second. But let's say for a minute that I've got this malcode.dll, and if only my attackers were dumb enough to name stuff like that every time, right? But I have this malcode.dll, and what I can do then is I can just say, rather than showing me the whole list of everything loaded into every process, just show me things that contain malcode.dll or some wildcarded path here. And so that's something that you can do. This is another one that I like to use here, the Tasklist /m wininet. Wininet is actually used for the Windows Internet functionality. So it's basically the underpinning. It's the library that has all the underpinning for all of the Internet Explorer stuff. And again, this is basically if you want to create an HTTP request, if you want to download a file from a web page, Wininet is where you go. And so you can imagine that a lot of attackers use wininet. Now they can do custom socket functions and deal with all the protocol handling, but with wininet you get SSL for free. Right? So wininet will take care of all of that SSL negotiation, it'll take care of all the HTTP negotiation, and it just makes everybody generally a happy camper. And so you can imagine then that attackers are going to use this. The problem is that we can't just say because it loads wininet it's bad. Lots of good things load wininet too. Let me tell you about things that don't load wininet. And so I see attackers use this technique called process hollowing quite a bit, where they start a process and then they take advantage of the process while it's running. So essentially the idea here would be that they would start a new process, something like maybe calc.exe is one that I see, or notepad.exe. And so they'll start something that I know doesn't import any networking functionality whatsoever, and it can't check for updates and none of that. And so we see that, and then we look at the imported modules, and calc.exe is imported wininet. And as soon as I see that, I know something has gone wrong. Right? It's kind of like a guy that has a perfectly good ID at a checkpoint, say a TSA checkpoint. His ID is perfectly good, but the guard looks at him and says, "Oh no, I see that you have a gun in your suitcase. That can't possibly be okay." Right? And so this is very much, I look at this like as the hidden gun in the suitcase here, right? For a calc or a notepad.exe. So just remember that one there as something to look for. Again, not everything that imports WinINet is bad. Most things that import it are okay. This just happens to be something that you can use as a potential differentiator. So here's Tasklist/m in action. And so a couple of things that we can note here. Again, the output is fairly verbose. Lots of processes have lots of DLLs loaded. Generally, this is the kind of thing you want to redirect an output to a file and then look at it offline. But then we're able to see down here as well using the WinINet search. And so that'll just show us all of the processes that have WinINet loaded. And again, if you find something like Notepad or Calc showing up with WinINet, something's gone wrong. All right, so there's something screwy going on in the machine. So what list DLLs? List DLLs is a great command line alternative for listing modules. The great part is it shows the full path for loaded modules. So in this case, we'll be able to immediately detect if we've been subjected to a path hijacking attack. Another great thing that we can do with list DLLs is that it can exclude signed modules. Most malware authors don't sign their code, so they don't have a valid digital signature. List DLLs is able to exclude signed modules and only display the modules that are unsigned. This really cuts down on the amount of noise that we have to wade through, particularly if we're just getting started. So the best thing about this is that it'll automatically remove all of the Microsoft signed DLLs. The only bad part about this is that it's not installed by default. So here's some output, some sample output from list DLLs. And so we can see here we get a couple of things. One other good thing that we get with this is we get this basically the full command line path, not just the full path for the binary, but actually the command line arguments that are being used as well for the binary. So in this case, you're able to see that it's service host -k net services. So you know which service host in particular it is, or if it's a service host, you know, -L -P 4444, then that looks a whole lot more like netcat, right? And so that helps us do some differentiation as well. You can see here that list DLLs will actually spit out some extra information for you. In this case, I have it set for only doing the basically only showing the unsigned DLLs. And you can see here that it's actually pulling out some of the metadata, such as the file version and the creation time, basically that are getting set by the compiler. So this is good data to have. It gives us some. Obviously, this can be forged, right? So the attackers can either strip this data out so it's not present, or they can change it to send us on a wild goose chase. But it's a start. It's something that we didn't have before. So. Process hacker. Process hacker is like the Swiss Army knife of malware investigation. So at least for on the host. And so process hacker can list loaded modules as well. No self-respecting geek, though, to be honest, would use a GUI tool when they have the command line, right? So process hacker, though, can be used to show memory allocations that the other tools miss. Basically what happens here, remember I said that the load library API is what puts something in the modules list. And so if we have a really good attacker, a skilled attacker, they can load code directly in without calling load library. And so Tasklist/m is just looking for loaded modules. List DLLs is just looking for loaded modules. They're not looking for allocated memory. And so process hacker then is able to show us all of this. Now this nice guy over here, this file name here, which is the full path, right? This is a non-default option. So you want to right-click in this top little bar up here and actually choose columns and add file name, because otherwise you just get this. And that's not what you want. I mean, that's a good start, but we want to see the actual path. We want to verify the DLLs where we think it's supposed to be. That way we can verify we're not subject to a path hijacking attack. Then there's the memory tab on Process Hacker, and this is great as well. We can use it to find injected code that doesn't use load library. And so what I look for in this case, and this isn't always bad, right? So there's some differentiation and some investigative techniques you need to use to find this stuff. But in this case, I'm looking in service host memory, and I find this page here that doesn't belong to any module. So if it belonged to a module over here, there would be a name, something like whatever, wininet.dll, and then we see our loaded address in memory, and we see RWX. And so that's essentially the page permissions. What we're looking for are read, write, and execute. Normally, when code's loaded into the system, it's marked read, execute. Right? And so because it has to be read, it has to be executed, but it never needs to be written again. And so that's generally only used, this RWX permission is generally only used by malware. There are a couple other fringe cases where there are uses for it, but when I see it, I start to wonder, hey, do I have, what do I have going on in the system? And in this case, this one is actually code injection. One of the ways that we can basically verify that is by dumping that memory segment, and we can use Process Hacker to do that. We don't have to use any tricks with Volatility or any other of our crazy system tools. We can right-click on the line that we want to take a look at. We can actually save it, and then we can drop it into IDA Pro. And as soon as IDA Pro comes up and it says, hey, this is definitely code, this is the function, a normal function preamble, this is regular assembly code, then we can say, yep, this was definitely a case of code injection, because we don't expect our processes, our normal regular processes, to have code outside of these memory segments. So some packers do this, but generally most commercial software is unpacked. So again, your mileage may vary. Don't immediately think something's an incident, but definitely this is something worth looking at. This RWX thing has helped me find many a code injection problem. So volatility. I got to do a plug here for the SANS Forensics 526 course, the new memory forensics course. They cover all kinds of different techniques for analyzing memory and doing memory forensics. In this case, I just want to talk about volatility and how we can use it for RE. We actually cover volatility and its specific uses for malware reverse engineering on day 5 of Forensics 610. So if you're coming to Forensics 610, particularly at the DFIR Summit, or any time for that matter, you can certainly look forward to learning how to use volatility for support of reverse engineering. We can use this DLL list command in volatility, and it'll list the DLLs in a specific process on the system. Here's a big bonus too, is that volatility can dump suspicious DLLs from a memory image for analysis. So even if they're hidden, even if you can't see them with Tasklist, or maybe you see them with Tasklist but you can't find them on the disk, no problem, DLL list will dump them right out of memory. And so this is volatility. Basically, we're using this to show the modules. Again, another nice thing you get here is that you get the full path to the process and any arguments in the case that the process had arguments. So again, this full path, and this really helps you identify that this is a legitimate copy of Internet Explorer, as well as seeing the DLLs beneath. Okay. Volatility has another awesome plugin. Remember I was talking about those RWX sections. And so not every RWX is bad. There are some other heuristics that volatility uses before it says, yep, this looks pretty bad. But essentially what it's able to do is it searches for memory segments that are map, read, write, execute, uses some other heuristics that I talk about in 610, but just for sake of time, I don't have time to talk about here, and then disassembles the code at these locations. And so what's great about this is that immediately, because I don't read hex very well, I haven't met a lot of people that do, so I don't often remember that 5.5, that this section here is my normal function preamble, but it disassembles this for me. And when I see this, I say, yep, that looks like code. Okay, I recognize that. This is definitely something injected into Internet Explorer.exe. And when I think about it, this makes a lot of sense, right? I have code that's injected into a process that is ordinarily allowed by the firewall to get out to the internet. And so probably in this case, what the attacker is doing is just taking a look, basically being able to bypass any firewalling type permissions or firewall type settings that might exist. All right, so I know it's been a few minutes since we talked about the APIs, so before I jump into doing any type of reverse engineering or doing an app share so that we can bring up VMware and IDA Pro, I wanted to talk, just do a quick review on these APIs. So create tool help 32 snapshot. This is the guy that goes and gets the list of processes, essentially a snapshot in time, what's running on the machine. And so that's basically where we start with tool help 32 snapshot. We're going to see a process 32 first, process 32 next. That's basically a way to walk the list and find the correct process. And then we look at open process. Open process is going to give us a handle back to the process that we want to inject into. So the attacker has to call this before he can do anything else. We're going to see this virtual alloc-x. Virtual alloc-x, again, is used to allocate memory. This is used to allocate memory in a remote process. Right? Then potentially, in some cases, particularly those tricky cases where we stay on a loaded module list, we'll see virtual protect-x. And this is often used in the case of, for instance, Metasploit. Right? So Metasploit uses this. Yep. So Metasploit uses this in Interpreter. the virtual protect X, and what it's essentially able to do, virtual protect can change those page permissions, because if you want to overwrite code that was already loaded, bear in mind most of that was loaded as read execute, and so this virtual protect is used to change that, at least temporarily, to read write execute, so the attacker can overwrite that code. Finally, we have this write process memory. That's going to write the code into our new remote process, or maybe just the name of the DLL, depending. And then we see this create remote thread. And again, that's going to create that new thread of execution in the victim process. So with that, it's reverse engineering time, which is what I really enjoy, and hopefully we can get a little bit down into the weeds here. I'm going to turn off my webcam just from a bandwidth standpoint, since I'm app sharing. I'd much rather you guys see the VM than my ugly mug. So let me turn this off. I'll app share up, and if you have any questions, I'm going to step through some stuff on IDA Pro real quick. If you have any questions, please post them into the chat, and I'll be more than happy to try and answer them either in line or definitely by the end. I'm going to try to stay very high level on this, not go too deep. But again, if this is the kind of thing that you get into as far as looking at a piece of malware, Forensic 610 is definitely a place to come and get a better handle on how to do it. Okay, can everybody see the app share, just to verify that that's up and running? Okay, good to go. I know at least one person can, so that's a good two. Okay, great. Okay, so I've got a couple of processes here, and so or a couple of malicious binaries here, and so what I'm going to do is I'll just take my first one and I'll drop it into IDA Pro. We use the IDA free version in the class just because the Pro tends to be kind of pricey, but the Pro version has some nice features and some nice features as well. So I'm going to come into my import section, and I'm really looking for. Remember that one that we held out was that big create remote thread guy, and so I'm going to look at this create remote thread. Oh, my camera's still running. Awesome. Okay, so I'm going to look at my create remote thread, and what I can do then is back up through the code and locate where this create remote thread is called from. So this just helps me hone in on the portion of this guide that actually does process injection. So what I'll do here is we'll just start back up here towards the top, and what we're looking for here, forgetting all the assembly, let's just assume for a moment that you don't have any assembly language experience. What I like to do here is ignore anything that you don't understand and just highlight initially, just highlight right here on these APIs, and you see a call and you see an API name beside it, then you can just refer back to the slides and say, yep, I saw that before. Jake told me when I see this to expect code injection. Right? And so we see this kind of clear process for code injection. We see a call to open process, and then we see a conditional. This check here where we branch either the green arrow or the red arrow is essentially checking to see whether or not we succeeded. If we failed to open the process, we can't inject into it anyway. And so moving on down a little bit, we see this virtual alloc X. They're allocating memory in the remote process. In this case, we see shortly thereafter, we see write process memory. In this case, they're taking the memory that they have. Essentially, they're taking the buffer that they're going to write into the remote process. Now they're writing into that process. In this case, it's just going to be the name of a DLL. We can tell that because we see this get proc address with this load library W. Now, if you ever heard somebody say load library A versus load library W, basically Windows internally does everything as Unicode, and I can only assume that's because Microsoft developers wanted to do internationalization, or they hate programmers. I'm not sure which. In any case, they essentially have this load library W. So the W means wide character set, essentially Unicode, and the A means ASCII, basically just a regular text. So in this case, we know the attacker's using Unicode. Not really important necessarily, but we see then that they're getting the procedure address, get proc address, so get the procedure address of load library. And that's how we can really tell in this case that they're going to be injecting a DLL by calling load library. That's ultimately going to be the start address. Of the new process. And it turns out that as we look here, we see create remote thread. And so just very at a high level, at a high-level standpoint here, in this one function inside of IDA Pro, we're able to quickly identify here all the hallmarks of code injection. So we can definitely say that this guy does injection. We don't know what he's injecting at. We don't know what process he's injecting into. But we can certainly come out of the subroutine and see if we can find any type of evidence of that, something that would point out potentially what he was injecting into, or maybe what type of DLL he was injecting. And so it turns out that just by looking at where this function, this is our code injection function. And so that's our code injection function, and we can see here just immediately above, and again, don't worry about the assembly. I don't think it's very difficult here to put together what the attacker is doing here. It looks like we're going into Explorer, and it looks like as well I would be looking for this netui0.dll. Now it turns out netui0 is a legitimate DLL name. If you look on your system in Windows System 32, I would hazard to guess that you as well have a netui0.dll. And so the question then becomes, what is the user doing? Well, or the attacker doing? We see this string cat call right here, right after the net UI. And if you go up just a little bit, string cat essentially concatenates two strings together, and the question just becomes, what string are we concatenating with? And so it looks like basically the expansion of the user profile string. So in this case, we'd be looking for netui0.dll somewhere in the user's profile, the exploited user's profile. So actually, let me take just a moment here now that we're on, because code injection is nice and it's really sexy. It's one of the cool things that happens in malware reverse engineering. Everybody likes to talk about it, but let's talk about let's talk for just a minute about our indicators of compromise. Because at the end of the day, when I do investigations, when I do malware reverse engineering, indicators of compromise are what pay the bills. Right? That's what keeps the client happy. That's what allows you to release, things like the APT1 report, all that good stuff, right? And so this happens to be a case where we can say, be on the lookout for netui0.dll, and we're looking for it in the user profile directory, right? So basically, we want to go to a sweep of the user profiles. If this guy has a roaming profile set up, we can expect that this is going to follow him potentially throughout the enterprise. We haven't looked for persistence yet, but right off the bat, we can say to look for those two things. We can also say to look on our running systems and do that tasklist/m or list DLLs, preferably list DLLs, so we can get the path and look for things injected into Explorer, specifically netui0.dll. And so again, this gives us a good way to start looking at our code. If we take a look at this Explorer guy where he's passed into here, I'll just jump into the subroutine quickly, and you can see in this case this create tool help 32 snapshot. We have a process 32 first, a couple of case insensitive string compares, and all the way down to process 32 next before we loop back up to the top. So again, all the hallmarks, the usual suspects are all here. Here's our create tool help 32 snapshot, our process 32 first. In this case, our particular function here, we would just call this something like PID finder, because he's looking for the process ID. And so we can then jump back out, and we see a straight call between basically a straight line between PID finder and the code injection function. So again, we know where he's injecting into, we know how he's doing it. He's using a standard load library method. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and close this out, and we'll take a look at a second one. It looks like I've got just a minute to take a look at a second example here, and then I'll turn it over, open the floor up for any questions. So basically, in this case, again, I'm going to do the same thing we did before. I'm looking for, in this case, evidence of code injection. That's what the webcast is about anyway. So we have that with that create remote thread. And in this case, we have a much tighter package, and I'll come back up to the top of the subroutine here. And what we see is that we don't know yet which process we're injecting into, but we see this virtual alloc-x. That again is used to essentially allocate memory in a remote process, and we see several calls to it. So we've got a call here, we've got another call here. There's a bunch of calculations and some manipulation that's being done here. It's outside the scope of this webcast specifically what they're doing, but in this case, you see several calls to different calls to write process memory. And what's happening in this case is that we're essentially writing different pieces of code into the remote process's address space. Again, we have multiple calls to write process memory, followed finally by a create remote thread. And so in this case, you can see that that we didn't have any call to a load library. In the last case, what we saw was the new thread called load library and loaded a new DLL, that netui.dll. This guy here, this is going to be much more difficult to detect because our attacker in this case is basically writing the process memory into the new process. He's writing the whole DLL there rather than writing the DLL name and letting the Windows loader handle it. Again, much more difficult to detect because we're not going to see the DLL name in the loaded modules list. So the process hacker technique of going in and finding those RWX, the read, write, execute segments, that's where we want to go in one of these cases, or simply stop it at the source. All right, so if we were looking for where is this guy injecting into, we can step out of the subroutine and see if we see anything around maybe the open process call up here that would indicate where we're at. So I don't see anything jumping directly out at us, but one thing I did want to talk about here briefly while we jump out is this SE debug privilege. Right? And so you'll oftentimes see this. This is very common in an interpreter style attack where, again, just like what we saw down there where we're not calling a load library, we're essentially doing an open process and we're writing the whole DLL carte blanche into the remote process's address space. This SE debug privilege is very common. SE debug privilege basically gives you the privileges of a debugger, and so this is only for admin users and people in the developer roles that can jump up and grab this privilege for all processes, but most users can grab the debug privilege for their own processes. And so what this allows users to do is basically change the page permissions and overwrite DLLs that are already loaded. You can imagine as an attacker where that could be potentially useful. So just so you have an idea of what it is that we're looking at there. So in this case, we've kind of stepped through, and again, we don't see immediately the process that we're trying to inject into. It turns out that this particular piece of malware does a good deal of obfuscation statically and deobfuscates at runtime. This is the kind of thing that once you determine that he's doing the code injection, you might be better off stepping through it in a debugger. So, and tell you what, we'll take one more quick look at this third example, and then I'll open the floor up for questions. So again, same deal as we did before. We're really looking again for this create remote thread. There are other ways to do code injection, but this is certainly one of the easier to show. And this isn't the same binary that we looked at before, but it does follow the same pattern, right? And so we see here the same thing with a create remote thread, the load library, get proc address. This almost looks like the same code, except it's a different process. Right, so it's a different malware sample. What's happening here is that we have attackers that will oftentimes share library code, or it's the same attacker and it's multiple different. Essentially, they've deployed multiple variants into the wild. When they deploy a new variant of malware, though, they don't rewrite all the code. And so, if you're looking for ways to detect that specific case, basically to hone in on something like this shared code between processes, I'm doing another webcast in a couple of weeks on Yara. Which is a tool that you can use to essentially track that between track known indicators of compromise and internals for your malware, and track that across multiple investigations. So tune in for that Yara webcast, and we'll talk about potentially how to track this between malware samples. And so we can see here, oh, that is my netui guy. Dagnabbit, he is the same process. That is a very common, however, this subroutine that we see here. This is very common and is shared between a large number of Chinese malware samples. Here I ended up pulling the same sample in twice, so I apologize for that. So, okay, well in that case, then I've loaded up the two samples that I was going to take a look at. I guess what I'll do at this point is open the floor up to any questions. Okay, well let's talk a minute then before we close out about some other injection techniques. So one of the techniques that we can use is DLL path hijacking. Again, if you're unfamiliar with DLL path hijacking, I strongly suggest that you check out Mark Baggett. Mark Baggett wrote some wrote some stuff for the SANS pen test blog and on DLL path hijacking. There's some other stuff about reflective DLL injection. Again, that's Harmony Security. Actually has a good, quite a good paper on that out there. Appinate DLLs, this guy's pretty interesting. So this is one of these things where in malware it seems like everything old is new again. Appinate DLLs basically was hunted into existence a while back. The idea is that you can essentially set up something for application compatibility, and then no matter what process starts up, as long as it loads user 32, it'll also load your code. And so for a while, nobody was able to use this because the antivirus is freaked out. And then Google came along with Google Desktop and started using it, and now basically the malware author said, hey, game on. We've got some other things like process hollowing, the set Windows hook X. That sounds malicious no matter what anyway, but regardless, we're able to see set Windows hook X, and that's actually used for code injection as well as some advanced techniques that involve remotely hooking kernel32.dll. And I haven't even scratched the surface. I know this looks like there are a ton of these techniques up here, but there are lots of variations of these that people use, attackers use to bypass antivirus and basically get around our defenses. So parting thoughts. This stuff's not easy to detect, but it's far easier when you know what you're looking at from a reverse engineering standpoint. So it's far easier to detect in general, and definitely if you have any RE training, it's far easier to work through this. One of the things that I would ask is do you know the names of the legitimate modules that could be loaded into your process? Or for that matter, which modules should be loaded into which processes? And the reason I ask this is that a lot of times, we show up to do an incident response, and we find out that we've got this process running something like a C Windows service host.exe. And that sounds good, except that service host is supposed to be in C Windows System 32. Right? Or I very commonly see C Windows System 32 Explorer.exe. Right? And of course the reality is that's supposed to be in C Windows. Yeah. If that all sounds crazy to you, rock on, right? Microsoft definitely has not made things easy for us. We've changed up some of the paths over the years, but the bottom line is we have to know what good looks like in our environment before we can detect evil. If we don't know what good looks like, we're kind of doomed to hoping, we're basically doomed to hoping that we're able to detect malware.exe running in the process list, and I certainly don't want to count on that. So if you want to know more about this stuff, if you want to really dig deep into reverse engineering, please join me at the SANS DFIR Summit in July for the 610 course. Follow me on Twitter. I'm MalwareJake. I occasionally post some nice malware tidbits. If you have any thoughts about unique malware persistence techniques, check out wipethedrive.com. To be fair, I have let that slip quite a bit recently. It's getting a facelift here in the next couple of weeks. And then read MSDN if you have any questions about how the APIs work. I think that's Microsoft Sleeping Aids. If you have any insomnia problems, MSDN may be able to solve those for you in addition to getting you some good knowledge. So any questions? I'll go ahead and turn it over to the moderators if they have any questions and or any questions have come up. And with that, I really thank you for your time.
Thanks, Jake.
And I hope to see everybody at the DFIR Summit.
Oh, go ahead.
Okay, so I've got a question here. Oh yeah, roger that. Yeah, I saw the questions popping up in the chat here. So the first one is from Greg Winkler. It says, malfind flag pages as RWX. When you look at the disassembled bits, it's all 0x00 found in CSRSS and when log on. Are these some of the exceptions? Yeah, so that basically what Greg is noting is that malfind has really has a lot of false positives. The good thing about it is that the disassembly helps us wade through some of those. And anytime I see something that's all zeros, I know that it's not code because all zeros doesn't make code. And so what we want to do is look at the disassembly output and or look at the hex dump and see if we can find anything that either has that familiar MZ header, which would indicate PE file, PE32 file, or anything that disassembles cleanly as code. And by cleanly, I mean basically looks like a function, looks like normal assembly code. And really to learn normal, you just kind of have to step up and learn to reverse engineer a little bit. But yes, this definitely is one of the exception cases. It's a good question, Greg. Thank you. Let's see. Okay, so where do we get RE training on assembly basics? Are there any good assembler intro to assembler classes? I don't know any good right off the top of my bat. This one's from Darren Bennett. I don't know any good right off the top of my hat intro to assembler classes, but I can tell you that coming to the Forensic 610 course, it's really a 5-day course that takes you from 0 to hero. I mean, it's kind of one of those deals. Now, you're not going to walk out and say, hey, I'm ready to knock out Stuxnet in the next hour and a half. But it is a good course for getting you up to speed on on all the basics. We do teach assembly in there, and if you already know assembly, we review it depending on how you're looking at it. But again, we go through all the basics. So, oh, you've taken 610, it's great, but okay. In that case, what I would suggest is the Kip Irvin. So it's the Kip Irvin assembly book. If you want to really dig deep into assembly, look at the Kip Irvin assembly book. Don't buy the newest copy. That guy makes just a ton of money on people buying the new copies of the book. And it's an academic book, but it's a good solid primer. So, okay. So what was the website? The website. I had a website up, wipethedrive.com, and so that's really all that's up there right now are the ShmooCon slides. So if you've already seen those, that's awesome. But wipethedrive.com was the website. We're getting ready to post a lot more content there and open up a user forum. Mark, this is a joint project between Mark Baggett and I, basically to look at unique malware persistence techniques. So let's see. I had another question here. Okay. Any experience with persistent ransomwares? Any common pattern that can be used to detect and clean? So the question has to do with persistent ransomwares. This is kind of out of the scope of code injection specifically, I think. And so persistent ransomwares, I have a little bit of experience with those. I wouldn't necessarily say a pattern, right? The best pattern is to not get infected in the first place, but that's not telling any of this audience anything. Yeah, I don't really have any good suggestions as far as the as far as what the ransomware does, encrypting data versus. There's no generic pattern that I could give you. Sorry, I don't have a better answer on that one. Okay. Yeah, so Kip Irvin is the name of the malware, or sorry, the assembly author guy. So I think that's all the questions that I have in the different chat rooms there. So with that, I think I'll turn it back over. Am I breathing helium? No. That's something called chipmunking that occurs sometimes where the audio catches up over a bandwidth delay. So, but thank you. Okay, so I'll turn it back over to Ben to close it out. Ben?
Thanks. Nice job, Jake. Thank you so much, Jake, for your great presentation and for bringing this content to the SANS community. To our audience, we greatly appreciate you listening in. For a schedule of all upcoming and archived SANS webcasts, visit sans.org/webcasts. Until next time, take care and hope to have you back again for the next SANS webcast.